And here I am, and welcome back. This is my office. Some might call it the rec room because it's really horrifying. But that's mostly because I've run out of space for books, and so they're just piled on everything. And once you start piling books on things, and then you have more things you need to pile on things, you have to pile them on top of the books. Anyway, I'm going to be dealing with that, as I think I've mentioned once or twice in the last few weeks. We're doing a whole lot of stuff around the house. So this horror, this monstrous trash pile down here is scheduled for some work also. So it will only be a matter of time, and it won't look completely different because, that's just how I live. But it may look a little neater in the background. I'm sure that Coco the gorilla and others will still be here. Anyway, before I go on, let me see what's going on here, why this thing is not... Okay, see if I can get it to focus again. I may have to get another camera. It's weird. But then, what isn't weird these days? What is not weird? I'd love somebody to tell me something that is not weird. Because it feels to me like everything is strange and unusual and difficult and scary and all of that. But we're all still here, and we're all still struggling on, and we'll continue to do so because, by God, that is the human way. And most of us are human. So anyway, hello. Good to see you all. I'm Tad. I'm going to be reading from the Dragonbone chair, which was not my first book, but for some people it's still my best known book. And yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing. I was telling people last night just that we're in the midst of a whole bunch of chaos and crazy around here. Mostly all good stuff. Hasten to say that. Our daughter and her partner, who is one of our other young people, came back after having been out of town for a month, working on things to prepare their young adult lives. And so it's lovely to have them back. And we are in the process, Deb and I, of trying to manage things here with the house because we have a lot of stuff we have to do. So we've got repair people, and we're repainting our deck, which goes around about 2/3 of the house and is a monumental job, which I was never going to do myself. It never even crossed my mind at any point that I was going to paint that deck. And after watching days of these nice people water blasting and sanding and all the stuff they've had to do, I'm just even more convinced that it was a good decision not to even entertain the idea. Because, I'm a householder. I'm a dad type, that's what I've become at this point in my life. I used to be a normal person, and then somewhere along the line, I became a dad. And I'm not talking about the fact of having actually reproduced, although that certainly is part of it, and it's probably the first biological click that starts the whole process of human into dadhood going. But it's more just you get to a certain point where you have things. And those things include people who are very dear to you, and animals who are dear to you also, and, a house or a place where you live that you have to take care of, and a career, or whatever you do that, if you're lucky, is your happy place, but also is what keeps you and that family and those animals alive. And a certain kind of dadhood kicks in, and I'm sure there's a female equivalent, so please don't think I'm saying this is only a male role. It's parenthood, it's adulthood, it's whatever you want to call it, but it kicks in, and as a result, you are suddenly find yourself like a completely different person. You're somebody who's actually walking around the house looking at things and going, why is that window open in the middle of the winter? For God's sakes, we're not heating the whole neighborhood. Those kinds of things that are like horrible cliches, but suddenly you find yourself doing them. If you're lucky, you have the discretion to pick and choose which of the cliches of parenthood that you use. If you're fortunate, you hear yourself about to say, because I said so, or something like that when you're exhausted from a long argument with a recalcitrant offspring. And you catch yourself and saying, that's a stupid thing to say, even though I now understand very well why my parents would sometimes say that to me. I don't want to say that. But there are other kinds of things that you find yourself saying and doing that you walk away shaking your head saying, oh my God, I remember how that used to drive me mad when I was a kid, when they would say things like that to me. You'll understand when you're older. Just wait till you have kids of your, the whole bit. So anyway, so that's kind of where I'm at the moment in my extremely advanced middle age. Don't anybody dare say otherwise. But in my advanced middle age, I'm deep into the, keeping what you have and taking care of it and fixing it up and, making everything nice, instead of that kind of common thing at an earlier age, which is, well, what does it matter? Someday I'll be rich and I'll be able to buy people to take care of it for me. And if I don't like it, I'll just leave it and I'll go buy another one, or whatever. So anyway, so that's what we're in the midst of at the moment. We are working very hard to fix up our stuff on the house that needs fixing. And with the idea that we're going to be here for a long time. That's the plan anyway. So before I start reading, let me check in and say hello to the folks who have showed up on this Sunday evening here in California. And the first is Mr. Unangst saying, Herr Williams, and I say, Herr Unangst. And who else? Jim. Jim Key says, what up, Tad? And I say, what up, Jim? Kristen. Hello, Kristen. Good to see you. Lori. Dia duit, Mr. Williams. Ooh. I'm not sure what that means. Dia sounds like day. So duit, do it, D-U-I-T. I am slightly puzzled, and that's a good thing. I like being puzzled. So, Lori, feel free to explain to me what if that's a language I should be recognizing. Is it Latin? Could be. Anyway, Barban, good evening to you. Good evening. Kelly, hello, good evening. But sad news day. Yeah, I know. I wrote something for those of you who are interested in that. I wrote something about two of my favorite people passed away in the last 24 hours. One of them was Nichelle Nichols of Star Trek, who played Lieutenant Uhura. Although I think by the later movies, she had been promoted a few times. And the other was Bill Russell, the basketball player and civil rights advocate, and just a super important guy to me personally because of I was introduced to him as a human being in not in person, but introduced to him and his importance in childhood. At a time when I was learning a lot of things about what was important in the world from my good friend Tim's dad. And Tim's dad, Bob, who was very important to me and kind of a second father to me, introduced me to a lot of things, including, music. And, I read his entire collection of Rolling Stone from back the very first issue when it was pretty much just sort of a broadsheet newspaper, and learned a lot about cultural history. And then also I had his record collection that he gave me access to, because at the time his own son wasn't as interested, and he saw me as like, here's a fertile young mind who I can introduce to, the blues and the black roots of American popular music and what was by then world popular music, and sports, because I was into sports when I was a kid, still am. And the importance of Bill Russell. So both kind of tough losses. On the other hand, they both led very long, very good, important lives. So yeah, R.I.P. Claudia, hello, good evening to you. Tim, greetings. Pierre, hello. Let me see who else is here. And Suzanne. Not typically awake at 3 a.m., but have a lot of work worry. I'm sorry to hear that. I know how that is. I have been there, so you have my sympathies. But if you're going to be awake at 3 a.m., I'm glad you're joining us. Jim, and I said hello to you already, but you're surrounded by Tad books. And I don't have fanboys. Don't put yourself down. What I have is friends and readers. The people who have moved to the next step beyond being readers, which is to be online friends of mine or hang out on these reading sessions or whatever. Those are friends. And if you just read my work, you're a reader, even if you like it a lot. I don't like the term fans that much because it kind of, I don't know, it feels like a diminishment. I mean, by that light, I'm a fan of a lot of people, you know. And I guess I could use it that way and understand that it's not a negative thing. But it always seems to make a distance between the people who are making things or doing things that I'm interested in and me as the person who's enjoying what they're doing. And I don't like that for my own stuff. I don't want that standoffish quality. Not that I'm offended by the term. When somebody comes up and says, "Oh, I'm your biggest fan," or something, don't get me wrong. I'm not going, "How dare you say that? I don't like that term." Now, of course not. But I don't ever want somebody to feel that, because I write books and they read those books, that somehow there's some kind of power imbalance, because they may very well be the same people who, I rely on in a million other ways in society, in this world we live in, med techs or, people who are dealing with my complicated insurance needs or whatever, Anyway, Jim, it's always a pleasure to see you. So, Greg, good evening. And Emily, hello. Emily says, hello, Tad and Tad friends. So hello back to you, Emily. As always, Margaret, good evening. Nice to see you. Becky, hello. Ray, hello. Greetings to you. Tim, Dragonbone Share was the first of your books that I read way back when I was in high school. Well, you think it was way back for you. It was even wayer back for me, just because I've been around longer. So not your first book, but the first of your books. Okay, got it. Yeah, I'm sure that's true for a lot of people, because the Dragonbone Chair series is still probably, in many ways, my best known. Emily says, "Ha, Tad, the cat has been avoiding me all day, but now that you're reading, she's here." Well, and I have a message for the cat, too, which is... Okay. So message passed on. Now I will continue. Timothy, checking in from Calgary. Hello, good to see you. How is Calgary? I miss Calgary. I haven't been there in years. But the 2 times I've been there, it was a very nice place, and the people were excellent. And I had a great time. I really did. Anyway, Jeremy, hello. You were sleeping at 1 a.m. last night? Yeah, that is a horribly responsible habit. You better do something about that soon, or you're going to find yourself doing things like getting up in the morning and making your bed before you leave the house. That way lies madness, my friend. Cliff, oh, you got COVID, huh? Wasn't too bad. All right, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I have to make an appointment for my new booster. Thank you for reminding me, actually. That's something I should be doing right this moment. But no, I mean, after I get done. I'm not going to do it now. Macdera de Birka. That is a very Celtic looking name. I would love to know how it's pronounced so that I can pronounce it correctly in the future. 3 a.m. there, drunk but engaged. Does that mean engaged in the broadcast, or that you went out, got drunk, and just found out that now you're supposed to marry somebody? I'd be interested to know. Anyway, who else is there? And everybody else here checking in. Lovely Lalani. Hello. Rochelle. Hello. And David. What is this Otherland novella you have apparently written? I've actually written a few Otherland things. The first thing I wrote, which was for the second anthology by Robert Silverberg, which the name of which has just slipped my mind, but somebody else can probably put it up on the chat thing. Anyway, I wrote a story called The Happiest Dead Boy in the World, and it takes place after the events of the Otherland books. Actually, all the things I've written set in the Otherland universe take place after the books. Happiest Legends 2, says Cliff. Thank you very much, Cliff. Legends 2 is the book. So if that's the one you're talking about, The Happiest Dead Boy in the World, you can find that in Legends 2. Then I wrote another one called something like The Dead Boy Detective, or Adventure of the Dead, or The Dead Boy Detective in Oz, or something like that, which was for an Oz anthology, but it's also about Orlando, and it takes place I think before the Happiest Dead Boy, at the point where they're restarting the Otherland network, and Orlando is having his first days as a ranger of the network. So I believe that's called The Dead Boy Detective in Oz. And then I wrote a third story, which I still don't think has seen print, although it's supposed to at some point, which is called The Something Prince and the Peach Maiden. The Peach Maiden and the Something Prince. And I've just gone blank because I write a lot of stuff. The Dead Prince and the Peach Maiden? I don't know, because it's another Orlando story. So that seems to be the one David's asking about. I don't believe that has actually been published yet, but at some point it will be. And I wrote it for an earlier iteration of the Otherland, or to go in conjunction with an earlier iteration of the Otherland game. And yeah, I can't think of the exact name of it. Again, maybe somebody can tell me about it. But that is scheduled to be published at some point. And as some of you know, I don't know if I talked about this last week or not. I think I did. My publishers have moved. They were never formally part of Penguin or Penguin Random House. They were always their own individual entity, but they were within the corporate umbrella. And so they had their own offices, payroll, books, all that stuff. But they would use the Penguin Random House or Penguin, or before that, New American Library, Salesforce, and other stuff. So they have left that arrangement and have now gone to another arrangement. And so, but that's been in negotiation for well over a year. So there's a lot of confusion in the pipeline. And in fact, I'm not 100% certain what's happening with the Navigator's Children. It will be published, I promise you. And it will be published sooner rather than later. But as to which publisher will be doing it, I'm assuming it will still be Penguin Random House. But no matter what it will be, the American editions will be DAW still. DAW, DAW, who has been my American publisher since 1985. And I'm in no hurry to change that. So that is the Something Prince and the Deathless Prince and the Peach Maiden. I don't know. Somebody who knows better than I. Actually, let me look it up here and see. Yes, the Deathless Prince and the Peach Maiden. Okay, so that's the name of the story. And the Deathless Prince is, of course, Orlando. And it was written to tie in with what was going to be a new Asian-focused area of the old video game. And so, but the story stands on its own as an Otherland story. So, So, Makdara de Burka. Makdara de Burka. Good. Okay. So, David, I will have an ask around about some of the, thank you, Makdara, by the way. David, I will have you have an ask around about some of the other stories and see if they can be found. But you might also pop in on my Facebook page or Twitter page and ask around if anybody knows, because some of these things are available, you know, as digital versions and things like that without having to go through finding a copy of the anthology. Although I have to say both of the Robert Silverberg Legends anthologies are both very good. They have a lot of really fine writers in it. George R.R. Martin and Ursula Le Guin and people like that. Neil Gaiman has got a story in it, certainly in the first one, I think. So anyway, they're worth finding just to have because they're all writing in their known universes, like George is writing in Westeros and stuff like that. And my first one I wrote, that's The Burning Man, and that's set in the Ostenard universe. But then when Bob Silverberg wanted another story for his second anthology, I said, could I write in the Otherland universe, even though it's not technically fantasy? And he said yes, and that's when I wrote The Happiest Dead Boy in the World. Okay. It was hello in Irish, by the way. Thank you, Lori. That's really good to know. Tell me how to pronounce it so I don't sound like an idiot. Diaduit? I have no idea. So I'd just be guessing. So please feel free to let me know. Anyway, Thank you for your time and attention. That's a bunch of information we've dumped out here. And now I'm going to read. So, as I mentioned before, I am reading from the Dragonbone chair. We have been through the first section where Simon has heard about the story, a little bit of a story of the conflict between the Scythi and humans, especially the Rimmersmen, who came in fairly late into the historical story and devastated much of the north and led to what ultimately became the destruction of Azua, which is, of course, the Scythi version of the castle where the Hayholt now stands, and also the destruction, in part self-caused, of Inaluki, who then in these books becomes the Storm King. Mentioned only briefly in passing as Hakatri, but Hakatri plays a much more major part in my current Ostenard series. Hakatri is Inaluki's brother, and you can meet Hakatri in Brothers of the Wind if you haven't already. So that's where that's at. So anyway, Simon then has gone off to the market with some money in his pocket to run errands for Judith the cook, and while there he's met a strange monk named Kadrak, a rather brooding character, and although he doesn't realize it yet, he has had a negative interaction with Kadrak because somewhere along the line his purse has disappeared along with his money that he was taking to the market, and he has come back to the castle from Urchester to discover everybody is extremely disappointed with him, which is all exactly the kind of thing that Simon is used to but hates because he's a mooncalf. Anyway, so now continuing with what I think is chapter 5, I'm guessing. Yes, chapter 5, the tower window, but we continue. Sunday came and went, a dark, slushy day in which most of the Hayholt staff seemed to be at chapel saying a prayer for King John, that or telling Simon to go away. He had exactly the kind of scratchy, irritable, kick things across the floor sort of feeling that could usually be soothed by visiting Morgenes or trekking out of doors to do some exploring. The doctor, however, was busy, locked in with Inch, working on something that he said was large, dangerous, and likely to catch fire. Simon would not be needed for anything. The weather outside was so cold and dismal that even in his misery he could not convince himself to go a-roving. Instead, he spent the endless afternoon with the chandler's fat apprentice Jeremias, tossing rocks from one of the turrets of the inner bailey wall and arguing in a desultory way as to whether the fish in the moat froze during the winter, or, if not, where they went until spring's arrival. The chill outside, as well as the different kind of chill in the servants' quarters, still prevailed moon day when he arose, feeling weedy and unpleasant. Morgenes also seemed in a damp and unresponsive mood, and so when Simon had finished his chores in the doctor's chambers, he filched some bread and cheese from the pantry larder and went off to be by himself. For a while he moped by the Hall of Records in the Middle Bailey, listening to the dry, insect-like sounds of the writing priests. But after an hour he began to feel as though it was his own skin on which the scribes' pens were scratching and scratching and scratching. He decided to take his dinner and climb the stairs of Green Angel Tower, something he had not done since the weather had begun to turn. Since Barnabas, the sexton, would as gladly chase him off as go to heaven, he resolved to bypass the chapel route to the tower entirely, taking instead his own secret path to the upper floors. Tying his meal securely in a handkerchief, he set out. Walking through the seemingly endless halls of the chancellery, passing continuously from covered passage to open courtyard and back under cover again, this part of the castle was dotted with small enclosed yards, he superstitiously avoided looking up at the tower. Eminently slender and pale, it dominated the southwestern corner of the Hayholt like a birch tree in a rock garden, so impossibly tall and delicate that from ground level it almost appeared to be standing on some far hillside, miles and miles beyond the castle's wall. Standing beneath it, he could hear it shudder in the wind as though it were a lute string, tight cinched on some celestial peg. The first 4 stories of Green Angel Tower looked no different than any of the other hundreds of varied structures of the castle. Past masters of the Hayholt had cloaked its slim base in granite outwalls and battlements, whether out of legitimate desire for improved security or because the alienness of the tower was unsettling, no one could know. Above the level of the encircling bailey wall, the armoring stopped. The tower thrust nakedly upward, a beautiful albino creature escaping its drab cocoon. Balconies and windows in strangely abstract patterns were cut directly into the stone's glossy surface, like the carved whalefish teeth Simon often saw at market. At the tower's pinnacle shimmered a distant flare of copper gold and green. The angel herself, one arm outstretched as if in a gesture of farewell, the other shading her eyes as she stared into the eastern distance. The huge, noisy chancellery was even more confounding than usual today. Father Helfkina's cassocked minions dashed back and forth from one chamber to another or huddled for shivering discussions in the chill, snow-flecked air of the courtyards. Several, bearing rolled papers and distracted expressions, tried to commandeer Simon for errands to the Hall of Records, but he bluffed his way through, protesting a mission for Dr. Morganes. In the throne room antechamber, he halted, pretending to admire the vast mosaics while he waited for the last of the chancellery priests to hurry through to the chapel beyond. When his moment came, he levered the door open and slid through into the throne room. The huge hinges creaked, then went silent. Simon's own footsteps echoed and re-echoed, then stopped, fading at last into the deep breathing quiet. No matter how many times he snuck through this room, for several years he had been, as far as he knew, the only castle resident who dared enter it, it never seemed less than awe-inspiring. Just last month, after King John's unexpected rising, Rachel and her crew had finally been allowed past the forbidden threshold. They had indulged themselves with a 2-week assault on years of dust and grit, on broken glass and birds' nests and the webs of spiders long since gone to their 8-legged ancestors, but even thoroughly cleaned, with its flagstones mopped, its walls washed down, and some, but not all, of the banners shed of their armor of dust. Despite relentless and implacable tidying, the throne room emanated a certain age and stillness. Time here seemed bound only to the measured tread of antiquity. The dais stood at the great room's far end, in a pool of light that poured down from a figured window in the vaulted ceiling. Upon it, the Dragonbone chair stood like a strange altar, untenanted, surrounded by bright dancing motes of dust, flanked by statues of the Hayholt's 6 high kings. The bones of the chair were huge, thicker than Simon's legs, polished so that they gleamed dully like burnished stone. With a few exceptions, they had been cut and fitted in such a way that, although their size was evident, it was difficult to guess in which part of the great fireworm's mighty carcass they had once sheltered. Only the chair back, a great 7-cubit fan of curving yellow ribs behind the king's velvet cushions, reaching far above Simon's head, could be seen immediately for what it was. That, and the skull. Perched atop the back of the great seat, jutting far enough to serve as an awning, if more than a thin film of sunlight ever penetrated the shadowed throne room, were the brain case and jaws of the dragon Shurakai. The eye holes were broken black windows, the teeth curving spikes as long as Simon's hands. The dragon's skull was the color of old parchment and webbed with tiny cracks, but there was something alive about it. Terribly, wonderfully alive. In fact, there was an astonishing and holy aura about this entire room that went far beyond Simon's understanding. The throne of heavy yellowed bones, the massive black figures guarding an empty chair in a high deserted chamber, all seemed filled with some dread power. All 8 inhabitants of the room, the scullion, the statues, and the huge eyeless skull, seemed to hold their breath. These stolen moments filled Simon with a quiet, almost fearful ecstasy. Perhaps the Malachite kings but waited with black, stony patience for the boy to touch a blasphemous commoner's hand to the Dragonbone seat. Waited, and then, with a horrible creaking noise, they would come to life. He shivered with nervous pleasure at his own imaginings and stepped lightly forward, surveying the dark faces. Their names had been so familiar once when they had been strung together nonsense in a child's rhyme, a rhyme Rachel. Rachel? Could that be right? Had taught him when he was still a giggling ape of 4 years or so. Could he remember them still? If his own childhood seemed so long ago, he suddenly wondered, how must it feel to Prester John, who wore so many decades? Mercilessly clear, as when Simon remembered past humiliations, or soft and insubstantial like stories of the glorious past? When you were old, did your memories crowd out your other thoughts? Or did you lose them? Your childhood, your hated enemies, your friends? How did that old song go? 6 kings? 6 kings have ruled in Hayholt's broad halls. 6 masters have stridden her mighty stone walls. 6 mounds on the cliff over deep Kinslaw Bay. 6 kings will sleep there until doom's final day. That was it. Fingal first, named the Bloody King, flying out of the north on war's red wing. Yeldon, his son, the mad king dire, leaped to his death from the haunted spire. Icferdig next, the burned king hight. He met the fire drake by dark of night. 3 northern kings, all dead and cold. The north rules no more in lofty Hayhold. Those were the 3 Rimmersgard kings on the left of the throne. Wasn't Fingal the one Morgane spoke of, the leader of the dreadful army, the one who killed the Scythe? So, on the right side of the yellowed bones must be the Heron king, Sulis, called Apostate, fled Naban, but in Hayhold he met his fate. The Hernesteer Holly king, old Tethtain, came in at the gate, but not out again. Last, Ailstan Fisher king, in lore most high. The dragon he woke, and in Hayhold he died. Ha! Simon stared at the Heron king's sad, pinched face and gloated. My memory's better than most people think, better than that of most mooncalves. Of course, now there was at last a 7th king in the Hayhold, old Prester John. Simon wondered if someone would add King John to the song some day. The 6th statue, closest to the stone's right arm, was Simon's favorite, the only native Erkenlander who had ever sat on the Hayhold's great seat. He moved closer to look into the deep-cut eyes of St. Ailstan, called Ailstan Fiskern because he came from the fisher people of the Glenowent, called the Martyr because he too had been slain by the fire drake Shurakai, the creature destroyed at last by Prester John. Unlike the burned king on the throne's other side, the Fisher King's face was not carved in a twist of fear and doubt. Rather, the sculptor had brought radiant faith into the stony features, had given opaque eyes the illusion of seeing far-away things. The long-dead artisan had made Ailstan humble and reverent, but had also made him bold, In his secret thoughts, Simon often imagined that his own fisherman father might have looked like this. Staring, Simon felt a sudden coldness on his hand. He was touching the chair's bone armrest. A scullion touching the throne. He snatched his fingers away, wondering all the while how even the dead substance of such a fiery beast could feel so chill, and stumbled back a step. It seemed for a heart-seizing moment that the statues had begun to lean toward him, shadows stretching on the tapestried wall, and he skittered backward. When nothing resembling actual movement followed, he straightened himself with what dignity he could, bowed to kings and chair, and backed across the stone floor. Searching with his hand, calmly, he thought to himself, "Don't be a frightened fool." He at last found the door into the standing room, his original destination. With a cautious look back at the reassuringly immobile tableau, he slipped through. Behind the standing room's heavy tapestry, thick red velvet embroidered with festival scenes, a staircase inside the wall mounted to a privy at the top of the throne room's southern gallery. Chiding himself for his nervousness of moments before, he climbed it. At the top, it was a simple enough matter to squeeze out of the privy's long window slit and onto the wall that ran beneath. The trick, however, was a little more difficult now than when he had been here last in September. The stones were snow-slippery, and there was a determined breeze. Fortunately, the wall top was wide. Simon negotiated it carefully. Now came the part that he liked best. The corner of this wall came out within only 5 or 6 feet of the broad lee of Green Angel Tower's 4th-floor turret. Pausing, he could almost hear the bray of trumpets, the clash of knights battling on the decks below him as he prepared to leap through the fierce wind from mast to burning mast. Whether his foot slipped a little as he jumped, or his attention was distracted by the imaginary sea skirmish below, Simon landed badly on the edge of the turret. He caught his knee a tremendous crack on the stone, nearly sliding back and off, which would have dropped him 2 long fathoms onto the low wall at the tower's base, or into the moat. The sudden realization of his peril spurred his heart into a terrified gallop. Instead, he managed to slide down into the space between the turret's upstanding merlons, crawling forward to slip down onto the floor of long boards. A light snow sifted down as he sat, feeling horribly foolish, and hugged his throbbing knee. It hurt, like sin, betrayal, and treachery. If he had not been conscious of how childish he must already seem, he would have cried. At last he climbed to his feet and limped into the tower. One piece of luck, anyway. No one had heard his painful landing. His disgrace was his alone. He felt in his pocket. The bread and cheese were rather nastily flattened, but still eatable. That, too, was a small solace. Climbing stairs on his aching knee was an effort, but it was no good getting into Green Angel Tower, tallest building in Erkenland, probably in all of Oostenrjd, and then not getting up any higher than the Hayholt's main walls. The tower staircase was low and narrow, the steps made of a clean, smooth white stone, unlike any other in the castle, slippery to the touch, but sure beneath one's feet. Sorry, I'm just smiling at the dog. This always happens when the pizza shows up. The castle folk said that this tower was the only part of the original Scythy stronghold that remained unchanged. Dr. Morgenes had once told Simon that this was untrue. Whether that meant that the tower had indeed been changed, or simply that other unsullied remnants of old Azua still remained, the doctor, in his maddening style, would not say. Having climbed for several minutes, Simon could see from the windows that he was already higher than Yeldon's tower. The somewhat sinister domed column, where the Mad King had long ago met his death, gazed up at Green Angel across the expanse of the throne room roof, as a jealous dwarf might stare at his prince when no one was looking. The stone facing on the inside of the stairwell was different here, a soft fawn color, traced across with minute puzzling designs in sky blue. Turning his attention away from Yeldon's tower, he stopped for a moment where the light of a high window shone on the wall, but when he tried to follow the course of one of the delicate blue scrolls, it made his head dizzy, and he gave up. Pause for a moment just to say, if you want to know exactly what colors I was seeing in my mind when I described that fawn color and sky blue, go have a look at a picture of the exterior of the Museum of Natural History in London. I had seen that about 5 or 6 years before I wrote this for the first time and loved those colors, and they stuck in my head. And so they wound up in the Dragonbone chair. At last, when it seemed he had been climbing painfully for hours, the staircase opened out onto the shiny white floor of the bell tower. This, too, constructed from the unusual stair stone. Although the tower stretched up another near 100 cubits, tapering to the angel herself perched on the cloudy horizon, the staircase ended here, where the great bronze bells hung, row by row, from the vaulted rafters, like solemn green fruit. The bell chamber itself was open on all sides to the cold air, so that when Green Angel's chimes sang from its high-arched windows, the whole countryside might hear. Simon stood with his back against one of the 6 pillars of dark, smooth, rock-solid wood that spanned floor to ceiling. As he chewed his crust of bread, he looked out across the western vista, where the Kinslaw's waters rolled eternally against the Hayholt's massive seawall. Although the day was dark and snowflakes danced crazily before him, Simon was startled by the clarity with which the world below rose to his eyes. Many small boats rode the Kinslaw's swells, lakemen in black cloaks bent stolidly over their oars. Beyond, he thought he could dimly make out the place where the river Glenawent issued out of the lake at the start of its long journey to the ocean, a winding course of 100 miles, past dock towns and farms. Out of Glenawent, in the arms of the sea herself, Warinsden Island watched the river mouth. Beyond Warinsden, to the west, lay nothing but the uncountable, uncharted leagues of ocean. He tested his sore knee and decided for the moment against sitting down, which would necessitate rising again. He pulled his hat down over his ears, which were reddening and stinging in the wind, and started in on a piece of crumbling cheese. To his right, but far past the limits of his vision, were the meadows and jutting hills of Achsamrath, the outermost marches of the kingdom of Hernistir, and the site of the terrible battle Morghennes had described. On his left hand, across the broad Kinslaw, rolled the Thrithings, grasslands seemingly without end. Eventually, of course, they did end. Beyond lay Naban, Firanos Bay and its islands, and the marshy Rand country, all places Simon had never seen and most likely never would. Growing bored at last with the unchanging Kinslaw and imaginings of the unseeable south, he limped to the other side of the bell chamber. Seen from the center of the room, where no details of the land below were visible, the swirling, featureless cloud darkness was a gray hole into nowhere, and the tower was momentarily a ghost ship adrift on a foggy, empty sea. Wind howled and sang around the open window frames. The bells hummed faintly, as if the storm had driven small, frightened spirits into their bronze skins. Simon reached the low sill and leaned out to look at the mad jumble of the Hayholt's roofs below him. At first the wind tugged as though it wished to catch him up and toss him, like a kitten sporting with a dead leaf. He tightened his grip on the wet stone, and soon the wind eased. He smiled. From this vantage point, the Hayholt's magnificent hodgepodge of roofs each a different height and style, each with its forest of chimney pots, roof trees, and domes, looked like a yard full of odd, square animals. They sprawled half atop one another, struggling for space like hogs at their feed. Shorter only than the two towers, the dome of the castle chapel dominated the inner bailey, colorful windows draped in sleet. The keep's other buildings, the residences, dining hall, throne room, and chancellery, were each one of them stacked and squeezed with additions, mute evidence of the castle's diverse tenantry. The two outer bailies and the massive curtain wall, descending concentrically down the hill, were similarly cluttered. The hayhold itself had never expanded past the outwall. The people crowding in built upward, or divided what they already had into smaller and smaller portions. Below the keep, the town of Urchester stretched out in street after careless street of low houses, wrapped in a mantle of white drifts. Only the cathedral reared up from their midst, itself dwarfed by the hayholt and by Simon in his sky tower. Here and there a feather of smoke drifted upward to shred in the wind. Past the city walls, Simon could make out the dim, snow-smoothed outlines of the Lich Yard, the old pagan cemetery, a place of ill repute. The downs beyond it ran almost to the forest's edge. Above their humble congregation, the tall hill called Thisterborg stood as dramatically as the cathedral in low-roofed Urchester. Simon could not see them, but he knew that Thisterborg was crowned with a ring of wind-polished rock pillars that the villagers called the Anger Stones. And beyond Urchester, past the Lich Yard and downs and stone-capped Thisterborg, lay the forest. Aldhjort was its name, Old Heart, and it stretched outward like the sea, vast, dark, and unknowable. Men lived on its fringes, even maintained a few roads along its outer edges, but very few ventured inward beyond its skirts. It was a great shadowy country in the middle of Ostenard. It sent no embassies and received few visitors. Placed against its eminence, even the huge Kirkcoil, the combwood of Hernistir in the west, was a mere copse. There was only one forest. The sea to the west, the forest to the east, the north and its iron men, and the land of shattered empires in the south. Staring out across the face of Ostenard, Simon forgot his knee for a while. Indeed, for a time, Simon himself was king of all the known world. When the shrouded winter sun had passed the top of the sky, he moved at last to leave. Straightening his leg forced out a gasp of pain. The knee had stiffened in the long hour he had stood at the sill. It was obvious that he would not be able to take his strenuous secret route down from the bell tower. He would have to chance his luck against Barnabas and Father Driosen. The long stairway was a misery, but the view from the tower window had pushed away his other regrets. He did not feel nearly as sorry for himself as he otherwise might have. The desire to see more of the world glowed within him, like a low-banked fire, warming him to his fingertips. He would ask Morgenes to tell him more of Naban and the southern islands, and of the Six Kings. At the fourth level, where he had made his original entry, he heard a sound. Someone moving quickly down the stairwell below him. For a moment he stood still, wondering if he had been discovered. It was not strictly forbidden to be in the tower, but he had no good reason for his presence. The sexton would presume guilt. It was strange, though. The footfalls were receding. Certainly Barnabas or anyone else would not hesitate to come up and get him, to lead him down by the much-handled scruff of his neck. Simon continued down the winding stairs, cautiously at first, then, despite his throbbing knee, faster and faster, as his curiosity got the better of him. The staircase ended at last in the huge entry hall of the tower. The hall was dimly lit, its walls cloaked in shadows and faded tapestries of subjects probably religious, but long since obscured. He paused at the last step, still concealed in the darkness of the stairwell. There was no sound of footsteps or of anything else. He walked as silently as possible across the flagged floor, every accidental boot scrape hissing up toward the oak-ribbed ceiling. The hall's main door was closed. The only illumination streamed in from windows above the lintel. How could whoever had been on the stairs have opened and closed the giant door without his knowing? He had easily heard the light footfalls, and had himself been worrying about the squeak that the large hinges would make. He turned again to scan the portal hall. There, from beneath the fringed trim of the stained silver tapestry, hung by the stairs, two small rounded shapes protruded. Shoes. As he looked carefully now, he could see how folds of the old hanging bellied out where someone hid behind it. Balancing on one foot like a heron, he quietly pulled off first one boot, then the other. Who could it be? Perhaps fat Jeremias had followed him here to play a trick. Well, if so, Simon would soon show him. Bare feet, nearly silent on the stones, he crept across the hall until he stood immediately before the suspicious lump. For a moment, reaching a hand out to the edge of the hanging, he remembered the strange thing Brother Cadrak had said about curtains while they had watched the puppet show. He hesitated, then felt ashamed of his own timidity and swept the tapestry aside. Instead of flying open to reveal the spy, the massive hanging tore free of its stays and billowed down like a monstrous stiffened blanket. Simon had only a momentary glimpse of a small, startled face before the weight of the tapestry knocked him to the ground. As he lay, cursing and struggling, badly tangled, a brown-clad figure shot by. Simon could hear whoever it was struggling with the heavy door as he himself wrestled the dusty, enveloping fabric. At last he pulled free and rolled to his feet, moving across the room in a bound to catch the small figure before it slipped through the partially open door. He got a firm handhold on a rough jerkin. The spy was captured, half in and half out. Simon was angry now, mostly from embarrassment. "Who are you?" he snarled. "You spire on people?" His captive said nothing, but only struggled harder. Whoever he was not big enough to loosen Simon's restraining grasp. Fighting to pull the resisting figure back through the doorway, no easy task, Simon was startled to recognize the sand-colored broadcloth he was gripping. This must be the young man who had been spying at the door of the chapel. Simon gave a fierce pull and got the youth's head and shoulder back through the door frame so he could look at him. The prisoner was small, and his features were fine, almost sharp. There was something a shade fox-like in nose and chin, but not unpleasantly so. His hair was as dark as a crow's wing. For a moment, Simon thought he might be a Scytha man because of his height. He tried to remember Shem's stories about not letting go of a puka's foot and so winning a cauldron of gold. But before he could spend any of his dream treasure, he saw the fear sweat and reddened cheeks and decided that this was no supernatural creature. "What is your name, you?" he demanded. The captured youth tried to pull free again, but was obviously tiring. After a moment, he stopped his struggling altogether. "Your name?" Simon prompted, this time in a softer tone. "Malachias." The youth turned away, panting. "Well, Malachias, why are you following me?" He gave a little shake to the youth's shoulder to remind him just who had captured whom. The youth turned and stared sullenly. "I wasn't spying on you," he said vehemently. As the boy averted his face once more, Simon was struck by a feeling that he had seen something familiar in this Malachias's face, something he should recognize. "Who are you then, sirrah?" Simon asked, and reached out to turn the boy's chin toward him. "Do you work in the stables? Work somewhere here in the hayhold?" Before he could bring the face around to look at it once more, Malachias suddenly put both hands in the middle of Simon's chest and gave a surprisingly hard push. He lost his grip on the youth's jerkin and staggered backward, then fell on his seat. Before he could even attempt to rise, Malachias had whisked through the doorway, pulling it shut behind him with a loud, reverberating squeal of bronze hinges. Simon was still sitting on the stone floor, sore knee, sore rump, and mortally wounded dignity clamoring for attention, when the sexton Barnabas came in out of the chancellery hall to investigate the noise. He stopped as if stunned in the doorway, looking from Simon, bootless, on the floor, to the torn and crumpled tapestry in front of the stairwell, then turned his stare back to Simon. Barnabas said not a word, but a vein began to drumbeat high on each temple, and his brow beetled downward until his eyes were the merest slits. Simon, routed and massacred, could only sit and shake his head, like a drunkard who had tripped over his own jug and landed upon the Lord Mayor's cat. And that, I think, is where we're going to have to stop tonight, although I will talk for a couple of minutes first, because next we start a very important chapter, Chapter 6, and there's no really good ways to break that up. So let me put my bookmark in. Anyway, I hope you don't mind. I stopped to explain that bit about the colors. It was one of those things I had not remembered until I came across it there, and I suddenly went, oh yeah, fawn color and sky blue or robin's egg blue. Yeah, that's the Museum of Natural History, which I was very taken by. If you don't mind, I will stop for every now and then and explain things like that. One of the things about the beginning of this book, which, as those of you who read it before may recall, it really, stuff doesn't start blowing up until about chapter 12. And there were a number of reasons for that. And I know it was a problem for some readers. The most common complaint that I ever had, especially about the Dragonbone chair, was it takes so long to start. I couldn't wait. And I understand that, especially even back in the 1980s, I understood that, that it's hard to make people wait to know what it is they're supposed to be enjoying. But there were a couple of things going on there. And one of them was that even at that time, and we'll talk about this during the Dragonbone chair, but one of the things that was going on when I was writing these books was a reaction to how influential J.R.R. Tolkien was in our field. Now, I am and was and always will be a J.R.R. Tolkien fan. Lord of the Rings was a crucially important book for me in a lot of ways. It really informed my life for a long time. It got me my first girlfriend. It meant a lot to me in many, many ways, although I have had many insights over how that came to be over the years, and some of them are rather interesting, and I will probably share them with you from time to time. But the main thing that was going on is before I started writing myself, I had read a lot of the fantasies written in the 70s, 60s and 70s. And some of them were very fine, and some of them were perfectly good, but there were things about them that bothered me. And one of them was the fact that a lot of people seemed to think that the stuff Tolkien had assembled, and he really did, he assembled different bits and pieces from folklore, from, the British mythic tradition and the European mythic traditions, and he squeezed them all together and made a thing he wanted to make, which was also influenced very strongly by his personal beliefs, his Catholicism, his dislike of the new, and his sort of I don't want to say worship of the old, but his preference for old things. And I felt a lot of people had taken these Tolkienian aspects, and you have those of you who only grew up in the last 20 years have no idea how influential Tolkien was in fantasy fiction and science fiction for a long, long time, because there was really nothing else going on. He was especially for fantasy fiction, he was kind of the summit that everybody used as a basis for comparison. And so anyway, I'm not going to go into long detail on this because there's more on this particular subject to talk about. But so one of the things I was doing was something that Tolkien also did. In his case, it was in part because he wanted to figure out what he was doing. So he spent a lot of time in the Shire at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring as he was kind of figuring out what the story was about. That wasn't my desire so much, but what I did want to do was I wanted to make the reader something that I hadn't always felt was true. I didn't feel in a lot of the epic fantasies written post-Tolkien that the worlds were really changing and realistic, and that there wasn't a sense of history to them for me, and that instead it was more as if these places were just waiting for someone to show up and find a magical token, and then history would start. So one of the things I really wanted to emphasize was that this place had existed. It had an existence. It had a history. Also, and this was very important for why the book takes so long to get to the action, or the dramatic action, because action starts right away, really, in the next chapter or two. But was that I wanted to people, because I knew that there was going to be big world-shaking changes going on in the world of Ostenard. And I wanted people to understand what the world was like, and especially what the world was like in Simon's rather insular, isolated view of the world. Because Simon is the everyman, the uncarved block, the human protagonist that goes out and learns more about life. And in the sense that the fictional journey is always a metaphor for the journey of life, Simon was going to start out as essentially a child and go out into the world and learn that things were not as simple as he had been taught. So I really felt it was important to establish the world that he had lived in, and that all of these people had lived in for many decades without much in the way of change, so that the changes, and especially the changes to the Hayholt, to Urchester, to Erkenland, would be something that the readers would really understand and would feel. You know, when Simon comes back in the end of these books to St. Sutrun's Cathedral, for instance, actually, I don't even remember now if Simon does or if it's Miriamel who comes back and Simon goes in another. I think just Miriamel. But I wanted the readers, anyway, when we as readers come back to St. Sutrun's, I wanted to have a feeling. When the story comes back to Green Angel Tower, I wanted people to know what it had been, how it was thought of, what it felt like before everything changed. The last thing, and then I'm going to wrap it up because we've run over. The last thing is also because at the time I was very influenced by two of my favorite writers, Mervyn Peake and T.H. White, as well as Tolkien. And so in the case of T.H. White, who did a brilliant job creating the boy King Arthur, otherwise known as Wart, in the film The Sword and the Stone, which was based on the first book of the Once and Future King. I wanted to have that kind of depth of, you know, this kid really is a kid. He's a gormless kid. He is a mooncalf. He doesn't know anything about the world. His intentions are good, but he's distracted. He's a 14-year-old, he's a dipstick. But also I was very influenced by Mervyn Peake and his Gormenghast books. And Gormenghast, which is another fictional castle, is one of the great creations, and the characters in it, but also just the castle itself, is one of the great creations of fantastical fiction. So I was very influenced by both of those things. And that's one of the reasons that the book starts the way it does. I wanted to sink people into the world. I wanted them to feel like they knew it before things started to change. I wanted them to feel how comparatively narrow Simon's experience of the world was and how constrained his world was before he goes out into the world and starts finding out how little he actually knows. Anyway, I've run over a bit. So thank you for joining me. A real pleasure. I will be back next week, first at 1 a.m. my time, and then again this slot, 7 p.m. my time. I thank you so very much for your attention and your company, and I will see you again soon. Take good care of yourselves, take good care of the people around you, and we will all survive to do whatever it is we need to do in this world. So thanks. Bye. Peace.